Welcome to the 2022 Empath Summit. I'm so excited that we have Emmy Marie here today to speak with us and allow us to learn more about blooming after trauma. Emmy Marie is a certified trauma-informed life coach from the Pacific Northwest, and let's welcome her. Can you tell us a little bit about your work and more about what you do?
I'm a certified trauma-informed life coach, and I focus on helping as trauma survivors from all over the world create thriving lives and relationships after past trauma. So that can look like one-to-one coaching with me, where we would sit down on Zoom, and I have a whole program that people walk through. I also do courses. I have a monthly membership. And I create a lot of free content as well on Instagram and TikTok, doing a lot of work around bringing awareness to what trauma is, how people may have gone about developing trauma, but more about how we can not just, I don't know, like I don't like to say overcome trauma because it's something that I personally feel like I'll live with for a long time, but more find like the power within ourselves and reclaim our own personal agency and power to create lives that feel meaningful and fulfilling and happy despite having, a rough or a painful past. So that's a little bit about what I do. And I'm sure it'll come up as we keep talking, but yeah.
I love that perspective of it not being something that you have to overcome. I've really never thought of it that way.
Thank you. Yeah, it is, something that it's not like I'm saying like, oh, it's the right way, but it's just kind of the approach I've taken within myself. And then within the work I do is focusing less on like how to no longer like think about the past. That doesn't really feel fruitful to me or helpful, but more about how to create a enjoyable and fulfilling present and future, while still living with trauma being a focus.
Marie, could you share a little bit about how you got here and started to do this work?
Absolutely. Yes, and maybe that came out wrong. I mean, more like I think people sometimes that, don't really understand trauma think like healing from trauma means like I never think about the past anymore, or the past has no impact on me anymore, which I definitely do not think is true, for me and for a lot of people I work with. But that doesn't mean that you can't like be happy in the future. But that being said, yeah, so I'm a survivor of an abusive relationship that happened when I was a teenager. So kind of in between the world of like childhood abuse and then like domestic violence, that went on for 3 years and is what most people would call like a narcissistic abusive relationship. So a lot of emotional abuse and verbal abuse, some sexual abuse, some physical abuse, kind of lumped into this relationship that was full of like really intense ups and downs and like very trauma bonded and just overall very toxic and harmful. So that happened to me when I was that age. And then I didn't really do anything to heal from it because I didn't understand how trauma worked. And I just thought, it's over, so I'll just move on. So I tried to do that. But what I know now is that when we don't really, process the past or things that we've been through, it's harder to not repeat those cycles. So I ended up being in some other really dysfunctional relationships. And after a few years, finally had a lot of onset of symptoms of PTSD and ended up going to therapy and getting diagnosed. Eventually learning about complex PTSD, which is not in the DSM manual yet, which is the United States kind of like diagnostic manual for mental illness. But it's sort of like, instead of PTSD, which could happen from like one incident, complex PTSD happens from situations that happen over a long period of time or are very complicated and chronic. So ended up having that and going on this whole kind of healing journey for myself, involving a lot of therapy, but also a lot of like personal inner work, some spirituality work, lots of reading, lots of listening to podcasts, and a whole slew of things. And then a few years ago, finally got to the point where I started kind of sharing about my journey on social media and sharing some of the things that I've learned that have helped me in order to try to help other people too. And eventually realized, I am at a place where I am able to hold space for other people and I'm good at it. So got trained and certified as a trauma-informed life coach. And I also am a NARM practitioner, which is a modality for working with complex trauma. And I've been doing that now for a year and a half full time, owning my own business doing this. And yeah, I feel like my healing work is never done. It's, part of being a survivor with a, long history of trauma is that, there's always going to be something to keep working through. But I've managed to, come a really long way, especially from that kind of cycle of relationships that I used to be in. And so I'm very passionate about helping other people do the same because I know just how painful it can be and how alone we can feel when we are recovering from trauma. So yeah, it's a little bit more about my story.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Can you tell us what the Fawn response is?
Yes. So, when Sara approached me to be on the summit, I thought like a spin that I could take onto this topic of being an empath is focusing on trauma's impact by way of like hypervigilance and the Fawn response. And so before I get into that a little bit, I think the identity of an empath is very interesting. And I am one of those people that's like, I don't really like hot takes, as in, I'm not going to be like, oh, empaths are, not real because trauma can cause it or whatever. Because it's like, if someone has that identity and they have no trauma, then it's real, But for me personally, I do identify as an empath, but I correlate it almost entirely to my trauma. And so I've done a lot of kind of learning about how trauma can cause this heightened sense of empathy that can become sort of like a superpower at times, but also an immense burden at other times. And so, yeah, when it comes to this topic of the Fawn response, what I'm talking about is a trauma response. So you might have heard of like the fight response or the flight response, maybe the freeze response. And the Fawn response is the fourth F response. And so, like all trauma responses, this is a way that we learn how to get our needs met and stay safe when facing overwhelming or threatening situations. And when it comes to the Fawn response, that involves us appealing to the people or the systems that are in power or are harming us in an attempt to lessen or eliminate that harm from happening. So the Fawn response can look like people pleasing, codependency, having this tremendous amount of empathy for people without any boundaries around it, kind of self-sacrificing, martyrdom, and to the most extreme extent, like Stockholm syndrome, or kind of being in love with your abuser or your captor. So that, that's kind of a general overview of what the Fawn response is basically we're trying to love someone into treating us well, or trying to appeal to people who may be hurting us in order to stay safe. Yeah.
Thank you.
Really interesting debate that I've noticed comes up in empath groups is, can you be an empath without having a trauma history? So I know there are some empaths who remember being that way ever since they were born and they had a perfect childhood and don't feel like there's any link between trauma and becoming an empath. Whereas others see a really deep connection. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I never want to take that away from anyone, just because I'm talking about how trauma can cause empathy or like heightened empathy. I'm not like, oh, so if that means you definitely had trauma, like it's okay, but that's kind of the world I come from is always talking about trauma and healing. So when I'm thinking about the condition of being an empath, that's what I'm typically thinking of.
Do you feel like you were an empath even from when you were little, or do you think that the traumatic relationship you had brought that to your life?
Really good question. So I looked up a definition for empath for this just to kind of help me narrow this down. And so the one I saw was, an empath is a person highly attuned to the feelings and emotions of those around them. Their ability to discern what others are feeling goes beyond empathy and extends to actually taking those feelings on, feeling what another person is feeling at a deep emotional level. So I feel like when I was a young child, I was definitely like emotionally sensitive. But I would not go as far as to say I was an empath. But I do think there's a lot of interesting correlations between my family dynamic and then subsequently the trauma I went through. So I had a really, you know, privileged, like loving family growing up, but both of my parents have sort of inclinations toward codependency on each other and towards a lot of enmeshment between, it's just I'm the only child, so me, my mom and dad having a lot of like enmeshment within our relationships. And so there was always kind of this, unspoken rule that if someone was not okay, it was everyone's business. It wasn't just like, you're not okay, obviously we can support and depend on each other, but also like it's up to you to kind of like take care of that, or like I'm going to give you some space to like feel that emotion. It was like if someone's having an intense emotion, then that's a problem and we need to like fix it right away. And so I think for me, this kind of taught me that to start being, paying attention to other people's moods and trying to make other people happy. And both of my parents put a lot of morality and value on, being good to other people and being of service and being generous and being loving. And so none of that is bad. That's like beautiful things to teach your child, but I think it can be taken kind of to the extreme. And so when I say I entered this relationship, I was 15 years old and I was just like the prime candidate for being in an abusive relationship because I was incredibly open, emotional, just wanted to be loved. And so unfortunately that I found someone who, was ready to take that knowledge and use it against me through harm and abuse. But yeah, coming out of that relationship, I feel like just like the sort of empath quality of feeling other people's emotions happened because in that relationship, in order for me to stay safe, I was constantly on edge trying to detect his mood, walking on eggshells, trying to make sure to not upset him because if I upset him, something bad was going to happen to me. So like that level of hypervigilance where you are constantly monitoring someone else's mood, I think that's what shaped me to having to, resonating with this definition of what an empath is.
Do you feel like for empaths or trauma survivors that when they have to set those boundaries, some guilt could come up or other feelings that they have to work through?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think if you've created a sense of safety in your body through making other people happy or pleasing people or, being super in agreement with people, having harmony, if that has constructed your sense of safety within your body, then naturally, even simply disagreeing with another person, even if you kind of know they're not going to hurt you, it can feel really, really scary and really dangerous. And if you're preparing for that danger and it doesn't come, but maybe, there's some conflict there, there's not perfect harmony, that feeling of, like overwhelming guilt can certainly come up to be like, why did I say anything? Why did I make this boundary? Why did I speak up for myself? Like, it doesn't, like what I said doesn't really matter, and just like all this like self-questioning and self-doubt. Because a lot of times it can feel safer to place the blame on ourselves than it can feel to, one, just say, sometimes we don't agree, sometimes we need boundaries, or two, that person is legitimately harming me and it, this conflict is their fault. Like all of that spectrum of experiences cannot feel really accessible or safe if our nervous system is highly attuned to, trauma and danger from interpersonal conflict.
What are some practices that empaths can do to calm their nervous system and also turn their attention away from everyone else and really focus on themselves?
That's a really good question. So yeah, I guess kind of like my approach to a lot of different challenges or obstacles like this is not to like exile any part of yourself or think that there's something wrong with you or it's bad to have heightened empathy or the fawn response or to try to like turn that off, because a lot of times when something hurts us, like if your empathy has ended up in a lot of harm, has resulted in a lot of harm for you, it can be easy to want to just like completely turn it off, or turn away from it or something like that. And honestly, like that's probably not possible. But even if it is, like there's nothing actually wrong with, being a loving person or being highly attuned to someone. But I think, yeah, the key word here is, starting to pay attention to yourself and having boundaries that allow you to do that. And so when it comes to this issue in particular, yeah, I feel like honoring like how empathy or the fawn response has helped you stay alive through any obstacles that you've been through, allowing that to exist and almost being grateful for that part of you for trying to keep you safe, while at the same time maybe acknowledging the ways that it has harmed you as well, and seeing if there's space to really hold, or see if there's room to hold space for both of those experiences. And then, yeah, starting to commit to, connecting with yourself instead of just maybe always connecting to other people or being so in tune with other people. It's like, I feel like for me, I can't turn that off. Like I can't just go into a room and be like, okay, I'm just like not going to feel other people's feelings right now. It's not really like a conscious choice, but it's more about like, while I'm still picking up on everyone else's stuff, can I also start getting in tune with my body and my nervous system and my mind and my spirit and, whatever, however deep you want to go with that. So I feel like for me and for a lot of people, it involves, spending some alone time and starting to commit to kind of solo practices or practices that are focused on yourself. So, things like journaling or meditating or any kind of like movement practice or spirituality practices, or, working with a professional like a therapist or a coach or something like that, where, you're paying someone to hold space for you, or, you're in some way like it's a session that's committed to you. So that can give you kind of a little more permission to focus on yourself and pay attention to what's going on within you, which can be hard sometimes when we're just hanging out with friends, to not just focus on them entirely. So kind of creating situations for yourself that are, centered on you, and starting to kind of get to know what it feels like in your body when you are picking up on other people's moods and they don't seem positive. Does that invoke like a fear response where you feel kind of like tight in your stomach or your chest? Like, does it lead to thoughts that are like, I need to fix this, I need to make sure everyone's okay? Starting to pick up on how you're feeling in those situations and making sort of a map of your nervous system. So comparing what that feels like to what does it feel like when you're totally at peace and totally relaxed, or feeling generally safe, and starting to kind of get to know how those things feel and really pay attention to them in your body. So then ultimately you can start, practicing being your authentic self. So, asserting yourself, making boundaries, kind of speaking your truth, which can be really, really challenging if you feel a lot of danger around upsetting other people. So something that's been helpful for me is practicing that with myself, just within my journaling practice, starting to express myself that way. I went on and sort of made, my Instagram account, which at one point was anonymous and was somewhere that I could just kind of freely post what I was thinking and not worry about what other people had to think or what other people in my real life thought. So, finding places where you can express yourself without necessarily like telling the whole world everything you're feeling and thinking, if that doesn't feel safe. But then over time, yeah, starting to kind of open up a little bit to people you trust, and just starting to practice what it's like to have your own opinions, to have your own needs, and to, express those without like apologizing or feeling like there's something wrong with you for, being a person that has needs and has their own individual feelings. So, I could go on about that, but those are some steps that I would say for, yeah, healing from this or working with it.
Sometimes people have never experienced a sense of safety in their life, even from when they were little. And I know from working with people, it can be hard for them to just take a deep breath or even to tune into their body at all. And I was just wondering how you help people to move through that.
Absolutely. And I think that's really good to mention is, especially if trauma has been from the time you were born, there might not be any sort of baseline that you can, clearly remember what it was like before and then compare it to what it's like now, to live, within your body and nervous system. So, honoring that that is sad, or you might feel angry, or you might feel numb or whatever. Like there's a lot of different ways you might feel about that fact, but letting there be space for those authentic emotions, I think that's a part of this whole process as well. And then, seeing if there's ways that you can create situations for yourself where you do feel safe now. And so this is sort of the kind of like self agency or like self empowerment process that healing is a part of, is like um, realizing that, and this is going to be different for everyone, but theoretically in this scenario, if you have created a life for yourself that is generally safe now, but you never feel safe in your body, seeing if there's ways that you can go about, carving out little moments or places, or, kind of crafting a setting for yourself that you imagine might feel really comfy, might feel pleasurable, might feel cozy or safe. I feel like for me, I do tend to go towards like cozy as my primary mode of finding safety. But it might be different for everyone. But thinking if there's anyone there, if it's something, if you're somewhere you're by yourself, is it somewhere in nature, is it somewhere in your house, but sort of creating a setting for yourself where you think there's potential for you to feel safe. There's also a number of, like body-based practices that can be helpful for trauma, like acupuncture, body work, massage, craniosacral therapy. I'm a big fan of taking baths, like temperature stuff. Yeah. So thinking about that as well, if that's possible, is like creating like those physical environments that support your nervous system's perception of safety. But yeah, and then also realizing that all of this takes time and it's a work in progress, but there is hope out there, and there are, avenues for feeling safe again.
I love all of those calming practices like taking baths that are so great for your nervous system. And one question I had is, what is being trauma informed?
So that's a really good question. I mean, I think generally the most basic answer would be trauma informed means you understand how trauma impacts people. But I feel like to be, kind of like when I say I'm certified trauma informed, that means I went through, a 3-month training program that was all about learning how to coach people in a trauma informed way. So taking into account how trauma impacts the body, how trauma is ultimately resolved and healed over time. Taking a special care to be aware of triggers, having sort of the psychoeducation around trauma to help clients better understand themselves. Yeah, so I think it's basically, being aware and conscious of how trauma impacts people and how we can best serve folks that have experienced trauma, which a lot of people have.
I saw some of your posts about how to speak to your inner child kindly, and I really did love those. I was wondering if you could share some of those affirmations with us.
So I feel like inner child work could also be really helpful, for almost everyone, but particularly if we're thinking about empaths, because it is sort of an avenue to start paying attention to yourself, or coming home to yourself, or all of this, starting to pay attention to yourself instead of just other people through the lens of kind of checking in, or reconnecting with your inner child. And so for me, this typically is me connecting with my inner teenager, since that's the version of me that, went through the trauma. Although I could connect to my inner child, that wouldn't be as kind of potent healing for me, since, I don't really have a lot of healing to do with my 5-year-old self as much as I do with my 15-year-old self. But yeah, I feel like sometimes when we are, activated or triggered or going through a hard time, it can be a nice resource to connect with the part of ourself that really remembers what it was like to feel powerless or hopeless or scared or however we felt in the past. And just kind of checking in and seeing like, what does that part of me need right now? Or just how are you feeling in there? So for me, this is typically something I do while journaling, is just sort of like imagining if I was sitting there with my inner child, what would she have to say? How is she feeling? And for me, it kind of can like flow out pretty naturally. Usually my inner child is like very vocal and has a lot of stuff to say. And, realizing it's just a part of my authentic whole human self. But a lot of times we can get so stuck in like our personalities that we've made as adults in order to, make it in life or cope with things. And so I feel like my adult self is very much like super focused on success or like moving forward in the future. And my inner child is like, can you please pay attention to me? Like, I'm still here. I'm still suffering. I'm one of those people that has a hard time, like, kind of feeling my feelings. So, inner child work is often me, connecting with real emotions like grief or anger that I may have had to shove down in order to survive that past trauma. But now, there can be a space for me to express those feelings and let them out there. So, yeah. And then, so, like, the post you're referencing was just some sort of like affirmations to, kind of like share with your inner child or just with yourself. Things like, I'm here for you now. Like, you're safe now. Everything's going to be okay. Like, stuff like that. Stuff that you would maybe say to a actual child, but, centering those on yourself.
I completely relate to having to do a lot of work on myself around accepting my emotions and also just recognizing them. And I know you mentioned journaling as a way that we can tune in more to our emotions and accept them. Are there any other practices that you find helpful?
Yeah, and honestly, this is one of those things that is still kind of an ongoing process for me. I feel like something that has been helpful for me when I feel disconnected from my emotions is noticing when I'm feeling like anxious or irritable or urgent, kind of like panicked, feelings of like in that fight or flight state where it's like clearly something's wrong, but I don't feel really like sad or angry. I'm just sort of like, like activated. So starting to kind of notice those moments as opportunities, if possible, to tune in and, check in of like, how am I really feeling right now? What is this trying to tell me? Like, what do I need from myself right now? And oftentimes what I need is, sort of quiet or space to allow those feelings to be present. And yeah, I mean, as far as like the feeling process goes, certainly I'm a huge fan of journaling because I love writing, but also just kind of creative processes in general, like any kind of art or movement or craft or something like that, that kind of connects you with your creativity or gets you in like a meditative state. Also, sometimes talking with other people can be really helpful. I feel like for me, it's much harder to process my emotions with others, but that's something that I'm still continuing to work on. Um, if you're feeling, a lot of anger or a lot of like activated energy, some things that can be helpful are like vigorous movement or like going on a fast walk, um, shaking your body, listening to loud music, like punching a pillow or screaming into a pillow or something like that where you're able to let that energy flow through you instead of trying to like repress it or shove it down. Yeah.
Do you find that a lot of trauma survivors are highly sensitive?
I'm gonna look up the definition of that because I just really like having definitions to
Yeah.
reference.
Sure.
Yeah. So highly sensitive person definition. Yes. The highly sensitive person is a term for those who are thought to have an increased or deeper central nervous system sensitivity to physical, emotional, or social stimuli. Um, I didn't really like that definition. Like that wasn't that interesting, but I mean, okay, I think we can all understand what a highly sensitive person is. Someone that is very sensitive to stuff.
Environment,
Yeah.
people, everything.
Right. Yeah. So I definitely think that, I mean, most of the trauma survivors I worked with, if not all, would consider themselves highly sensitive. And so, you know, we were talking about the fawn response. That's sort of like this response where we might take those feelings of hypersensitivity or extreme empathy and then need to do something about it. So we start fawning and start appealing to people. But before that is just the perception of people's moods or, you know, the environment or our bodies or something being heightened. And so, you know, the trauma response of like hypervigilance or feeling like, you know, when you experience trauma in your body, essentially there is this idea that you're not totally safe or there's certain things that are dangerous. And so in order to stay safe, our body learns to, you know, constantly be looking for danger. And so this is like an evolutionary trait that helped our species survive through, you know, facing so many predators and conflicts and all sorts of stuff in the course of human history. But now, you know, while it is this really valuable survival response, it can be very difficult when, you know, your trauma stems from abuse or interpersonal conflict of some kind, because our bodies might now become extremely attuned to everything to try to keep us safe and, you know, feel really hyper vigilant about, you know, what was that facial expression? Why was their tone like that? You know, just kind of always on the outlook for something to go wrong, ultimately, so we can stay safe. Yeah, so kind of like, I feel like healing from trauma helps us integrate that of like being sensitive is not, you know, a bad thing necessarily, but it can really feel like a burden when you're constantly hyper aware of everyone else around you or just everything. So sometimes I feel like healing can allow you to kind of like let go of that a little bit. But to me, it hasn't really been like a conscious choice of like, I'm just going to not be hyper vigilant anymore. Like that doesn't work. But it slowly can kind of happen over time as your body starts sensing like, I am safe now. Like, no one's going to hurt me if I'm not perfect, etc.
Do you feel like there needs to be more awareness in the world around being trauma informed, or do you find that people even know what it is?
I think in general, the world would absolutely be a better place if it was more trauma informed. Just because then there wouldn't be so much of the narrative of like, you need to get over it and move on. Because, you know, a lot of the people I work with, and myself included, start healing from trauma or processing the past because there is no other option. Like it's impossible to function anymore without the past constantly, you know, making you feel afraid or some type of way. But for a lot of people out there who maybe have not been through as severe of trauma or just have never had the opportunity to do the healing work, or, you know, there's so many people who have been through things when they were younger that were traumatic, and did not process those things and end up perhaps harming other people. You know, we hear the phrase hurt people, you know, and it's like, it's very true that a lot of abusers are trauma survivors themselves that never had the opportunity to heal from that. But that's, you know, maybe a small section of people, but a lot of people out there are really wonderful, loving, kind people, that might suffer from a lot of, you know, self-doubt or insecure relationships or trust issues or lack of self-confidence at work, or like a lot of different things that if maybe someone would have held space for them to process the past and to have their needs met and have their feelings be honored and respected, then they could have moved through that. versus being told like, hey, just get over it, you're fine. That, that's kind of the anti-trauma informed view of things, and it can lead to, yeah, just a lot of suffering in general on a variety of a scale of things. So I definitely operate in this kind of trauma informed bubble, and so it's like one of those things where, I'm every day working with trauma survivors on Instagram talking about trauma, that I do forget that a lot of people still don't quite, know what it is, and I sure didn't 6 years ago. So it's not like, I'm not going to point fingers and be like, it's a failure of this or this. It's just like something that we're still learning about. But yeah, I'm definitely hoping, I feel like there's positive change happening. I feel like more and more people are becoming aware of it. So yeah, that's my perspective.
And it's sometimes I see from working, I also work in the public schools, and it's not that if you ask the teachers what's, being trauma informed or what's trauma, they could tell you, but it's sometimes it's making those connections, like kids are misbehaving a lot, and what could be behind that.
Right.
Yeah. And sometimes it's just the resources
aren't
quite there to support.
Right. I feel like that's such a good point when it comes to schools, and also like healthcare. There is a huge need for more trauma informed, like across the board with a lot of those institutions. But it's like, it's not like the teacher, it's not necessarily the teacher's fault if they're unable to hold space for a young child's like behavioral outburst that is stemming from trauma, because they have a whole other classroom of kids they have to also tend to and care for. And so I feel like it can be super helpful to learn more about trauma and understand, why kids might act out, or like how to be more trauma informed when it comes to working with patients and in healthcare or something. But at the same time, it's like we also have to set up those systems to have the resources possible to care for people in need, instead of putting it all on like the teacher or like nurse or something to take that upon themselves. So it's a very complicated issue, but yeah, I feel like it totally changed my mind. I used to work with kids doing like summer camp and environmental education, and when I learned about trauma and how it impacts behavior in kids and stuff, it definitely was like a huge like light bulb moment for me, because it's like, oh, like maybe kids don't act up. For me, it was always like, oh, because I'm a terrible educator and I don't know what I'm doing, so that's why they're not paying attention. And it's like, no, that's probably not true. Yeah.
That's so true. Yeah, definitely. I can say one of the biggest things that's going through my mind is about, I'm also an only child, and how that could sort of contribute to being more empathetic, or just in tune to people's changing things. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
I'd love to open it up to see if anyone has any questions.
Yeah. I mean, well, I would love to take questions, but just to chime in on that a little bit.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that makes so much sense. I feel like there's something about being an only child where, not always, but I think, one of those kind of like common stereotypes or whatever is like, you are like a little adult, and like you don't have as much space to like be a kid and kind of like mess up, because the spotlight is always on you. And so it's easier to kind of like grow up really fast and try to be like an adult. And you like lap up all the attention if you're being responsible, or if you're being productive, or if you're being helpful, compared to like if there's 5 kids, maybe you can disappear for a little bit and like, go be a child. And I think eldest children and only children relate on a lot of things as well. Is like that responsibility and like having that attention on you, compared to like, if you were one of 5 and you were the youngest or something, it's like maybe you can go run around and play a little more and not have to like be so responsible all the time.
Right, that's so true.
Yeah.
How can people get a hold of you and find you?
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and just type my website in the chat.
Okay.
emmymarie.com, and from there you can find me on Instagram and TikTok and Pinterest. I have a lot of free resources on my website, and I have an email list where I send out emails often. I have monthly membership community for trauma survivors, where each month I do a workshop, like an educational workshop, and then we also do a community call where we all hang out and share and reflect and, you know, have questions and hang out with each other. And then there's like a private community space for that as well. And then I have a course launching next month. It's my fourth time launching it, all about creating safe and supportive relationships after trauma. And then I also do one-to-one coaching if anyone needs that kind of high level of support as well.
If you can't see the chat, I mean,
I do see it.
Okay, you can see
yes. It. Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. And you're welcome.
Thank you so much for being here and for sharing everything that you did with us. I really appreciate it, and I've learned a lot.
And yeah, thank you everybody for being here. Awesome. Well, I hope you have a great rest of your day and a wonderful rest of your summit.